Hi, Anthony.
Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good morning. Good
How
afternoon.
are you?
Fine. And
Okay.
well, there it is still morning, isn't it? It's
Yes, it's
11
about 11
a.m.
o'clock.
Okay.
11 o'clock in
Yeah.
the morning, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Hi,
Good
Antonio.
afternoon.
Yeah.
How you feeling? You're feeling better?
I'm feeling much better, yes.
Yeah,
Good.
that is
Better. Still a little weak, but
Oh, sorry to
but
oppose on you.
the spirit is strong.
the spirit is strong.
That's what matters.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what matters, right?
And I'm
Right.
sorry to impinge on you, this lecture when you don't feel so well.
No. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of those things. You know, it happens, and at this age, you know, you can expect all these little things here and there, and so we have to deal with it. That's it. You know. Yeah, I also had a not a very good year because my father passed away. About a little over a month ago. So I had to go to India on a emergency basis. And these days, you know, you can't just go to an airport and board a flight. You have to go through these COVID tests.
Complicated than that.
Very complicated, and it's very anxiety creating. You know, because you never know if your test will turn out to be positive or negative. Anyway, yeah. So these health related things have, and of course we are at an age that all of these things can be expected. So.
Yeah, you told us your father passed away. It's a couple of months ago, I think.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Very recent.
I mean, he was old. He was quite old. So it's not that it was unexpected, but I think the way he went is unusual. Well, it's usual in the sense he had a fall, and after that was it. So it wasn't anything else. He seemed to be okay, but yeah, he just had a fall, and once you break something, then I think it just goes down.
You lose the willpower, to continue.
Yeah,
living.
right.
Yeah.
And he also decided, I think, it was time to go. Yes. So anyway, so how are things in Brazil these days?
Oh, so good, so bad, so good.
Today we got the very good news that our economy is in recession.
Okay.
In recession.
Is Bolsonaro will be able to finish his term, or will he be kicked out before that?
Yeah, he'll finish the term, but he's losing completely his competitiveness for the next elections.
Right.
I would say that the former judge from car wash operation can be the second candidate. It's going to be Lula and him. But Lula is doing pretty well so far, and there is the possibility of an alliance with the former governor from São Paulo, who was formerly from the PSDB, from Fernando Henrique's party, and there is this. He changed the party; he's going to another party, and there is this invitation that he would be the vice president candidate for Lula's candidate.
Right. Yeah.
So I guess just we have a couple of people here already know Irina, Zurba, and Henok, and Bruno.
Yeah.
So just to give us a few minutes, we're just chatting a little bit away here to give a few minutes for our people to join us.
Yeah.
Hello, Irina. Hello, Bruno. Hello, Henok.
Hello, Bruno.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting.
Irina, are you from Russia?
I am from Ukraine, but I live
Ukraine.
in the States.
Welcome.
Oh, you live in the States. Okay. Yeah, for the last name could be Russian or Ukrainian.
Yes, Slavic origin, Ukrainian.
Yeah. Slavic, but different from Polish names, because the Polish names, they have a very different structure.
Polish is also Slavic language. It's like whole group of languages, like
Czech, but
Polish,
it's
Russian, Ukrainian, Bulgarian.
That's it. Russian, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, they are similar. They're more similar than Polish and Hungarian is not Slavic.
Hungary is completely out of the.
Hungarian is something.
No similarity with it's like
Outlier.
Yes,
Just like the Basque region in Spain. Euskera.
Right.
It's a totally different language. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
The Hungarians doing their own thing as usual.
Yes, as usual. Right.
Yeah.
Hungarians are doing the real. Yeah. So Bruno, where are you from?
I'm
Meaning
originally
your
from Germany, but I'm working in Mexico.
Ah,
Living
I
and
see.
working in Mexico.
I see. Okay. Right.
And yeah, exploring things with Moises and Antonio.
Okay, good. Good. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm hoping that.
Where are you from originally?
I'm originally from India. But yes, as you can very well recognize that I have a Portuguese last name.
Yeah.
But that is because of at some point the Portuguese were in India. So, but then there are these two different communities. I'm from the eastern side, and the more recognizable Portuguese influence community is actually on the western side. But we
Goa.
actually have Goa, which is Goa and other, But I'm from the eastern side, which is lesser known. But we pretty much have, very similar names and Portuguese names. In fact, it was very interesting when I first went to Brazil in 1987. There were a lot of words that I heard in Portuguese, but we also use those same words in my own language.
Okay.
So clearly, of course, they are loan words, but the loan words they may have some Arab origin. I'm not so sure, but a lot of the words. So, for example, for window we say janela, and in Portuguese we say janela, right? And then for a key you say chave, and we say chavi.
Chave.
Yeah, chave and chavi. So there are certain kinds of words that we actually use, which are so almeira, for example. And I think in Portuguese it's almeira. I think for the cupboards. Yeah. Yeah, so there are a lot of these kinds of words that I discovered them in Brazil, interestingly enough.
Okay.
I mean, I was using them in India, but then I discovered them in Brazil.
But you also have Portuguese ascendancy, or
we may have, yes. I tried at one time to see if I could trace back, but no, there is definitely. It's just that question is how. Where exactly the link, when the links actually begin. But there have been priests and so on. And in fact, we are basically a Catholic community. I mean, a Catholic community in a context of, on the eastern side, of course, is a Muslim community. Majority is Muslim in the part that is now Bangladesh today. So which is really a Muslim sort of context, but small, Catholic community. And the Goans, of course, are largely in a Hindu context. So they are also Catholics, Roman Catholics. I think there is a very long tradition of that Portuguese influence. In fact, we do have some, there are some interesting words which, mainstream, like Bengalis, which we are part of the community, they don't have those words, but we have them. Like, so compadre, actually we don't use compadre, but we say kompu. So kompu actually comes from compadre, actually. So, but we are the only community that uses those words, and who knows what it actually means, not anybody else, so it's yeah.
Well, in Mexico that's very, very common.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think language is one of those things. With the European expansion, I think all kinds of influences went along. And we always think of Chile as an Indian invention, but it isn't. It came with the Portuguese from somewhere else, from South America. So it's obviously over time you think it's yours, or
Germany, it's with the potatoes, no? Everything is about potatoes, and
Yeah.
I don't know what they had to eat before the potatoes
Yes,
came
I
to
know.
Europe.
Right, exactly. I mean, really, what did they actually have without potatoes? I mean,
They starved, probably. We
Right.
saved the potatoes.
Well, I think two questions. First, we are broadcasting this, we are transmitting on the YouTube channel, and I will start the transmission now. And the second is if you can also record, just in case something doesn't work well with the live transmission, then we have the recording, because then I upload in our YouTube channel.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, I invited a couple of colleagues, but they said they couldn't participate, and they would like to have a look at it afterwards. So yeah, I think would be a good idea.
Okay,
sure,
great.
Okay, should I get started? Moisés, you want to do the introductions? You want me to?
Okay.
No, I think you could do that.
Okay, so let me get my my notes here. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. I know this is, I think, is the sixth or seventh event of this series on of seminars on comparative political economy 2020-21 on Asia. And it's a great pleasure for us to have Professor Anthony da Costa, who is an eminent scholar in global studies and professor of economics at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I just want to make a change in the program. Unfortunately, our commentator, Professor Maria Cristina Cacciamali, who's a professor at the School of Economics and Administration and the Latin American program at the Universidade de São Paulo, she fell ill over the last week. It seemed like we had been hit by Professor da Costa also fell ill over Thanksgiving, and so we're afraid that she's going to make it. But our commentator fell ill, and she's in the hospital right now. And she excused herself, asked us not to excuse herself to all of you, but unfortunately she was totally unable to participate. So unfortunately, you guys are going to have to deal with myself and Moisés making the initial round of comments. But I hope the public be able to make a lot of comments and criticism of the talk. So these are the major change in the program. So this event is organized by a number of institutions, the Economic Sociology Network of Rio de Janeiro, which is my own graduate program in political sociology, the graduate program in Anthropology and Sociology of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and the sociology program, the graduate program in sociology of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. They are in the Rio de Janeiro region. And this is jointly with the graduate program in comparative studies on Américas of the University of Brasilia, of which Professor Moisés is one of the directors. And we will have the support of the Economic Sociology Research Committee of the Brazilian Society of Sociology. So I'd like to just acknowledge their support and their kind of indulging this lecture. So as I said, Professor da Costa is a professor at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Over the last 30 years, he taught also at the University of Melbourne as chair and professor of contemporary Indian studies at the Copenhagen Business School, as the AP Moller-Maersk professor of Indian studies at the National University of Singapore and the University of Washington as professor of comparative international development. I'm not going to read it through everything he has written. You received the abstract. He's an accomplished scholar in terms of development, comparative international development. His work on steel, autos, IT. His latest paper is on the handloom industry in India, and he also has a very broad view of comparative development. Have studied these topics in China, Japan, and India, and South Korea. And he's been interested in the issues of capitalism, globalization, state, economic nationalism, development innovations, industrial restructuring, employment challenges, international migration professional. He's been working lately on that, in wealth and inequality, which comes out in this some more recent work. So, and he's written or edited dozens of books, published books, chapters, and journal articles, and lecture widely. He has received multiple fellowships, including the Fulbright Hayes American Institute of Indian Studies and the Abe Fellowship from the Japan Foundation. He contributed to research efforts of multilateral organizations and served on numerous academic and professional committees. So it's with great pleasure that I give the word to Professor da Costa, my good friend Anthony da Costa. Anthony, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio and Moses, for putting this together. And of course, I also thank all the organizations behind this effort. It's quite clear that a lot of work has gone behind the series itself. And I wish I had known a little bit earlier about the series, then I could have also listened to some of your other speakers as well. But I have read through the abstracts of those. And so then I will proceed with that basis and sort of move on with my lecture. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Let me just hold on here. Slideshow from start and oops. This is always share screen. Okay, share. And okay, can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
You can see the screen. Okay. All right. I'm going to reduce this. All right. So, anyway, so this is an idea that I have been working for a number of years. The idea that capitalism in broadly in the global South, although I have not done too much empirical work in the global South per se, but I have taken a lot of work into understanding the process of capitalist development in India in a very sort of wide-ranging sort of way. And from simple observations, it is quite clear that the kind of things that go on in economic development in a country like India is not quite what we would expect given the knowledge that we have about economic development in general. Not only starting from the sort of classical sort of forms of development in the industrialized West, although they are no longer industrialized as such today, but also in the latecomers, such as some of the smaller latecomers, such as in the East Asian economies, and then, of course, more recently, a very big economy and kind of quite an unprecedented type of development in the case of China. So this sort of is the sort of background to which I, of course, situate India. And of course, even though my understanding is somewhat limited, or at least not as in great depth as I have of India, nevertheless, I think I can see some parallels, but also some big differences in terms of the way these economies have evolved over time. So it's quite clear when I looked at your comparative political economy series, really the main thrust of most of these talks that I observed, and most of them were on China, although there was also in the case of South Korea and Brazil as well. I think Antonio presented on Brazil. It's really about institutional change. And of course, when we say institutional change, we are really talking about the way rules and regulations and forms of intervention, the way they are sort of either designed or they spontaneously emerge to shape the certain sort of economic development sort of outcomes. Some are, of course, very spontaneous, others are more deliberate and conscious. And in the end, of course, they try to produce certain kind of quote unquote desirable economic outcomes. So clearly the role of the state, or to put it more precisely, the developmental role of the state is important. And the contemporary discussions, at least from what I gathered from reading the abstracts of the various presentations made in this series, was a lot of it focused on industrial upgrading, regional innovation systems, small and medium enterprises and their decentralized network, especially in places like in Taiwan, for example. So these are some interesting questions, no doubt, about contemporary capitalism. But it seems to me that the papers probably, and of course I am guessing here, probably did not really talk about capitalist trajectories in the very big sense. In other words, what is the path of development in a bigger sense in these kinds of countries? How might they differ from other places, and so on? These are some of the issues that I will be touching upon, mainly the form and substance of the nature of contemporary capitalism in India. But in the end, I think all of these papers investigate, even if they don't explicitly say so, really they are exploring some form of structural transformation. And when I say structural transformation, I have obviously, have something very specific in mind, and that is how these economies have moved away from agriculture to non-agricultural forms of economic activity. So that's the sort of crux of my main sort of discussion, and that's what I'll focus on. So in the context of this background of the Comparative Political Economy series, I have my own intellectual growth also has come out, and Antonia has already referred to them very generously. But I think they have been the building blocks of the way I am thinking these days. And so, for example, the first book that you see is on the restructuring of the global restructuring of the steel industry. Brazil actually was part of that study as well, along with some other countries like South Korea and India and Japan as well. This one is the auto industry, where I bring in the role of Japan in transforming the Indian automobile industry. And the third one is on the information technology industry, but with a very specific sort of connection to the Japanese economy, because that's one economy that is not really discussed when it comes to the supply of human resources, technical human resources, because much of the discussion, and rightly so, is with respect to the United States, which is the biggest sort of IT market. But given this sort of sectoral approach, then of course, I sort of began to think in some other bigger macro kind of way. And of course, probably this book, which was published in 2010, A New India, is probably the beginning of thinking about these bigger questions about trajectories. Capitalist trajectories. So really capitalist trajectories, but as you can see, visually you can see that it's really about uneven development. Uneven development is, I think, a very simple and yet a very sort of interesting sort of concept to capture the way economies around the world sort of evolve, and especially those economies in the global south. The others are about, mostly about Asia, but obviously with other people I have worked with. This is on China and India. This is on South Korea, but more in terms of after its sort of fantastic sort of experience of growth and development. And the more recent two books are about, again, back to India, where and this is something that I will be talking about more today, about the question about agriculture and land in India, and what does it mean for capitalist trajectory. So the objective then of the presentation is to offer an alternative structuralist understanding why contemporary capitalist trajectories in the global south are different from the earlier, if you will, capitalist countries. And then I take on an important case of India. And of course, India is studied, no doubt, by obviously India experts around the world, but India has always been in the shadows of China and East Asia, because the trajectories are actually quite different. And the explanation that I use is to bring in two ideas, that is compressed capitalism and lateness. And of course, I want to sort of show how capitalism is being compressed or squeezed in a way that sort of allows the simultaneous coexistence of developments that are both sort of advanced sort of forms of capitalism, but also there are regressive elements of this capitalism. So, and I think this is something that probably one would notice it also in the case of whether it's Mexico or Brazil or Argentina and so on, although obviously in some very different sort of ways. But this is what I want to sort of emphasize, this uneven and combined development that we see that represents both advanced and regressive elements of capitalism. So there are really three parts, conceptual and methodological notes, and then I talk about compression and lateness in India, and then I provide some features of this compression in India. So two interrelated concepts, compressed capitalism and lateness. It's a macro-historical political economy of development approach. I look at the world economy as the unit of analysis in the sense that it's kind of a Wallersteinian, Brodelian sort of approach, but at the same time, I am very, very sensitive to the local details. But in the end, I think the discussion of these trajectories must take place at a global level. I don't think you can sort of nail it down at the national level and talk about trajectories, although that trajectory that one nation can exhibit is definitely can be analyzed from on its own terms, but I think in the end, it would be far richer to situate it in the larger global sort of context. All right, so that's sort of the background. So what is compressed capitalism? Okay, I mean, I have a very straightforward understanding of what capitalism is. It's a market-based economic system, profit motive, you are extracting economic surplus through wage labor, and of course, it's regulated by the state. So this is a very straightforward, simple definition of what capitalism is. Now, the question, of course, is where does the source of compression come about? Now, the starting point is that the diffusion of capitalism takes place in a very sort of uneven and combined way. In fact, referring to Celso Furtado, he talks about internal colonialism, which again doesn't get too much attention, but within large economies such as India, I mean, there is a considerable amount of regions that dominate other regions and so on. And there is a certain kind of colonialism that takes place within the country that also produces this uneven and combined development. But in the end, it's the diffusion of capitalism that is very uneven across the world. And we can see it over time and space. Historically, we can see that. Clearly, of course, starting points are different, the impacts are different, and of course, every country has gone through their, particularly in the global south, different sort of influences from the colonial sort of countries. And that has, of course, led to a certain kind of state response. The state response, of course, is a response to late capitalism in the sense that previously they were dominated or subjugated by foreign powers or foreign influences. And of course, once they became sovereign nations, then they tried to pursue a path of their own. And this is where, of course, the compression begins, because in the end, what the states are trying to do is essentially narrow the gap, both the economic as well as the technological gap between the front runners and the latecomers. I mean, that's the general sort of process by which we see. But the interesting thing, of course, is that in theory, of course, we have a very good abstract understanding based on past historical experience as to what these processes might be, in what sequence they might follow, and so on and so forth. But I think the real challenge, of course, is that when we look at contemporary capitalism, and particularly in places like India, what you find is that there is no neat and clean sequencing of these types of processes. They're kind of, they almost seem random, although I don't want to use the word random, but they are here, and there are explanations for it, but yet they are not neat and clean as we might want them to be, and as if there is a certain linear sort of process by which there is going to be capitalist development. And the next point that I want to sort of mention that uneven arises precisely because there are other countries that are ahead. So in other words, this notion of combined development is really conceptually what it is saying is that because of the presence of others, the development sort of is influenced by that presence, which means that what latecomers do is dependent on what early countries have already achieved. And this, again, is, I think, in an interesting way, in a very dynamic sort of way to think about what are the possibilities or what are the limits of, let's say, the global south, all right? Especially when it comes to manufacturing and industrialization. So this is, of course, Celso Furtado, and that's me, by the way, in 1987, having a very long discussion about Brazil, which was kind of interesting. So what is lateness now? When we talk about lateness of the lateness, of course, has to do with the fact...
reunião de 5 às 6, eu não posso dirigir. Se for dirigindo, põe no negócio do carro.
Does somebody have a question, or I don't know? Okay. What is lateness? So lateness is, of course, entry to industrial capitalism, and it is to lateness to material transformation, to be like the West. And of course, historically, we have various degrees of lateness. I mean, you start off with UK, but then followed by Germany, US, other parts of Europe, Japan, then comes, India, Brazil, Latin America, East Asia, Southeast Asia, more recently, China, Vietnam. So one can actually map these out in some order in terms of their lateness to entry, although difficult exercise, no doubt, but I think, crudely we can do that. So there is a temporal and spatial and institutional dimensions of lateness, and it has to do with the timing of entry. How quickly you enter, how much catch up you can do, in what sectors, and then also identify some of the lagging sectors. So this is where I think this uneven development comes about, because there are some sectors that are very dynamic, that are very global, they're globally oriented, very competitive, and yet there are many other sort of lagging sectors that tend to sort of pull the economy, in some other kind of direction. And the quality of entry, of course, also varies. And in this sort of effort, institutions at the time of entry are also very important, because they could either foster or hinder the speed and process of capitalist development, such as institutions of modernity, legal system, and of course there are legacy problems. Every society has some baggage, historical baggage that seems to get very, very difficult to get rid of. So, for example, ceremonialism is a concept that was used by Iris many years ago, and talking about how the global developing countries generally have this notion about ceremonialism, which means that it's really about status and prestige and those kinds of things. And those things also have a hangover effect on the kind of trajectories that these countries can experience. And this is a graph that we're all familiar with, and I think this sort of is a way to think about this process of economic development, whereby you can see that there is a turning point in the 19th century, roughly around in the middle of the 19th century, a big turning point with the Industrial Revolution, and of course the West and its offshoots take off. And then, of course, followed a bit later, about 100 years later, you see East Asia. And then, of course, maybe another, 25 years, or 30, 40 years ago, begin to see China, and then the rest of the world. So clearly, this in itself captures the uneven economic development based on the ability to extract economic surplus differently. So clearly, it is a transitional kind of an issue, whereby there is a shift from feudalism to capitalist production. Commercialization and profit-making and application of knowledge and efficiency become the sources of this turning point for the different sort of regions of the world. And latecomers, including China and other economies, including India, for example, they are all sort of trying to pursue this kind of a path. But lateness in itself is a factor to be considered, only because they are influenced by what has happened previously, especially among the early industrializers. To give you a visual sort of understanding, so this is Goldman Sachs's new Bangalore campus, all right? So nobody from this picture will imagine that this is actually in India, right? But if you look at the next picture, of course, this is, small workshops. As you can see, people are, making probably garments or repairing certain things using certain very simple machines in some sort of slum or favela, as in the Brazilian case, probably in Mumbai somewhere. All right. So these two visuals, of course, depict the kind of uneven development that I am making references to. And the question is, of course, how does this arise in the first place? Right. So then let's look at this question about compression and lateness. So now, theoretically, and of course, this is very simplified and perhaps somewhat reductionist, but nevertheless, I think it helps us frame the problem. And that is when you look at the classical sort of capitalist progression, so you have this process called primitive accumulation, which is really the agrarian transition. So you can think of Victorian England as that period when you have the formation of workshops and the movement of basically peasants into these workshops as factory workers. So work was being organized under factories, And you have this process of primitive accumulation, which essentially refers to dispossession of the peasants from the land. Now, this dispossession can take a variety of forms, including very, very violent forms. And this has, of course, taken place across the world in different contexts. Certainly, we know in the case of Brazil. In fact, I read, many years ago, a number of novels by Jorge Amado, and he tells me about of the Brazilian sort of plantation in the Northeast, in terms of what was really going on in terms of land ownership and so on and so forth, how land was being, sort of usurped by certain groups of, people, dominant groups of people. So this is a form of primitive accumulation, the separation of peasants from the land, which of course then leads to what we would call an industrial workforce. And in that process, of course, the state becomes a very, very important player in regulating and managing that process. Initially, perhaps less so, but over time they fine-tune the institutions, and as a result of which also they foster what I would call capitalist maturity. In other words, local capitalists, local commercial interests become very mature, and they know how to manage in the world of capitalist competition. So you have the appearance then of, or the formation of formal markets and the disappearance. And so this is the thing, the disappearance, almost complete, although there could be pockets here and there, but disappearance of petty commodity production, which is the small scale, owner-operated kind of production systems, small scale sort of production. Now let's come to late capitalist, what I call compression. Now, in countries like India and many other places, this primitive accumulation is still going on. It's not a complete process. In fact, this agrarian transition that is moving away from agriculture to non-agricultural activities, this process is unresolved. And this, I think, is the crux of the problem of, let's say, the kind of development that India is witnessing. Although the discussion is not really centered around, at least in the mainstream. In India, too, you have state capitalism, or in late capitalist countries, you also have state capitalism. In fact, more so, because they want to play this catch-up game, and in the process, of course, contribute to capitalist maturity. There is a certain amount of leapfrogging that is going on. So certain types of sectors and industries, states can help narrow the gap, technological and other institutional gaps within certain types of sectors. So you can think of, the more traditional heavy industry, like say steel industry or automobile industry or machinery industry. These are things that countries like India, Brazil, and other larger sort of mature global South countries can actually do. They can undertake these kinds of things. In addition to, of course, moving on to other things. And of course, Brazil, we know of, aerospace, for example. India, we also know of the space area. So these are obviously pockets of efficiencies, if you will. But the other interesting element to this late capitalism is that the states are creatures of, states are generally creatures of society. But in these kinds of cases, the state is often captured, or what it amounts to a fragmented state, because there are multiple competing interests that are impinging on the nature of the state. So sometimes the state has a very hard time in negotiating with all of these types of groups, pressure groups, so to speak. As a result of which also the policies don't tend to be very clear-cut. They're often kind of, hodgepodge of different things trying to meet different sort of needs. So this is also the nature of a late sort of, capitalist development, where the state is not quite the role that it plays. And finally, of course, the very distinctive feature of this late capitalism is that there is a persistence of petty commodity production, which means that small scale production remains very, very important in many of these economies, and certainly in the case of India, which is in contrast to the disappearance in the earlier sort of classical sort of transition, whereby the small producers virtually disappear and capital becomes organized on a very large scale. So the overall impact of this kind of process, of course, is that you have uneven development, or what we call economic dualism, or you have what we call enclave development. So the agrarian question then becomes the sort of a very important sort of entry point to discuss what is the nature of capitalism in a country like India. We know what is primitive accumulation. It's really the origin of capital. And in the context of developing countries, of course, they mechanically, at least we can say that really what it involves is expelling the so-called surplus labor, the Lewisian turn, so to speak, right? To expel the surplus labor from the countryside so that agriculture becomes more productive with fewer people engaged in agriculture. Now, interestingly, of course, in the global context, we know that the European countries have had a wonderful opportunity in the earlier part of the 20th century or even late 19th century to send out their surplus people to North America, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. Estimates show that about 30 million in the 19th and early 20th centuries, people have moved from Europe to all of these places. And the share of these immigrants is high relative to the total population of those societies. Now, this is something that is generally forgotten in the scheme of this discussion about primitive accumulation. In other words, I think it would be an interesting question. I don't have the answers to them, but I think it would be an interesting question. Where would the Scandinavian countries be without this possibility of expelling their surplus people at one time to the new world, so to speak, right? I think this is an interesting question that I think we should keep in mind. But in the end, agriculture then becomes an instrument, I think, to provide, to generate sort of demand and income, which would then, of course, sort of foster industrialization and non-agricultural activities. In other words, we expect through capitalist development that the agricultural sector will become less important over time, which of course the rich countries will tell us. In fact, many other countries will tell us that agriculture is no longer that important as it used to be. So when we look at the sort of structure of the Indian economy, India, in some ways, at least in terms of its contribution to GDP, that is a sectoral composition of GDP, you can see that India is following a very traditional, conventional kind of a trajectory in the sense that share of agriculture to GDP is falling. Now, this is expected. With economic development, economic growth, and with the rise of non-agricultural sectors, we can expect that the value of agriculture to GDP will fall. And but interestingly enough, India's manufacturing sector, although it does take off in the 50s with a great degree of state intervention, but then it begins to sort of flatten out and almost, I would say, stagnant today. And that's manufacturing. And of course, the residual category services, it takes off and obviously has reached almost 60% in the case of India, which generally you would think that for an economy like India with low per capita incomes, you would think that manufacturing or industry would be form a greater sort of component to India's GDP, but it is not the case. And this is where I think the anomaly begins, right? And the other interesting thing to note here, this dotted line that you see is actually the high value services, which is finance, insurance, real estate, and business services. And many of these services are actually tradable, which means they are exported. So it's a very peculiar structure that we notice that at one level, it's very conventional that the agricultural sector has fallen, industry correspondingly has risen somewhat, but has plateaued out, but services has taken off, and more importantly, high value services seem to be taking off as well. So in this sort of context, of course, then the question is there a Lewisian turn? And I leave it as a question at the moment. I think it's important to just sort of keep that in mind. And I have updated this information with more recent data, although, again, you know, in India, the data is generally good, but not always very reliable, depending on who is in charge and what's going on, and especially these days with the government that we have in India, a lot of times they manufacture data these days. But nevertheless, these are official statistics. But again, the same trends can be seen. In fact, services have gone up. You can see that industry is kind of almost stagnating, in fact, in the more recent years. And of course, you have the agricultural sector has reached a point where it's not falling any further. To give you a contextual understanding of India's agriculture versus, say, China, China is now less than something around 9 or 8% of GDP, whereas India is still about a little over 20%. So obviously there is still a big difference even in the agricultural sector, but that's also stagnating in India. And then you have the high value services, which is, I mean, basically equal to the value of agriculture. So which again it reflects a certain kind of anomaly. And this anomaly, of course, is nothing other than the fact that Indian capitalism is actually quite compressed. In other words, certain types of sectors that are supposedly sectors of the future, they emerge much earlier. Now, when you look at the composition of employment, you will find, of course, that this is where there is no Lewisian turn, because what you see is that agriculture remains a very, very dominant sector, even though there has been somewhat of a decline in the employment share, but it is still about 50%. So 50% of India's workforce is still tied to agriculture. And I think this is what I mean that by the fact that one has to understand what is going on in agriculture in order to understand the trajectory of Indian capitalism. Now, without going into all of these details, obviously these notes will be available. You can look at it. But what is really going on, and I think some of the important developments is that this land has become an important issue in the context of India. There is no discussion about redistribution of land anymore. There used to be, but really no real discussion. Land holdings are getting very small in India, which of course is consistent with the small scale type of production that I referred to earlier. And there are, of course, good reasons as to why that is the case, inheritance laws and so on and so forth. But there are also other reasons why land holdings are becoming smaller. And this is the feature that I referred to earlier, is that the rise of the petty commodity producers. In other words, small scale, individual owned types of enterprises which try to make a living. And I say make a living because these are not enterprises that are highly profitable and income generating. They generate enough income for almost like a subsistent type of existence. But there are lots of these petty commodity producers, both in the countryside, but also in the urban sort of areas. Something that I think we would find across the world in the global south. And they are both waged and unwaged. So obviously a lot of family labor is also involved. Now, the other interesting development that has emerged in India is that agriculture, basically there is a crisis in Indian agriculture, and one can get into a lot of details about that, but I will not go into it. Perhaps in the question and answer session, I might bring some of those up. But really, the one interesting development that has taken place in India in the last couple of decades, let's say, is the rise of non-farm rural activities. So in other words, agriculture is not that profitable for the smallholders anymore. So what they do then is that they tried to find non-agricultural types of activities in the countryside, or they migrate to the cities. But one must also understand that Indian migration, although it has been taking place, is actually quite slow. Nothing like what China has experienced, certainly nothing like the level of urbanization that Latin America has witnessed, and I think partly because of their earlier sort of independence in the 19th century. Obviously, this process of migration takes place in India, and it can be also seasonal, but it is slow compared to, say, China or some other countries. All right, so this is another very interesting kind of a development. And the rise of this non-rural activities, largely construction, some simple services, and transport, in other words, buses, trucks, or whatever. That sort of rural services, but they're all precarious forms of employment. This, I think, is the new development. So what is happening is that the people are not leaving the countryside, and the people are not necessarily experiencing a rapid increase in their incomes, even though they have now diversified some of their economic activities into these non-agricultural types of activities. But in the end, they are still very precarious forms of livelihoods. So this is one example of this kind of development that is taking place. Gradually, there is an encroachment on the agricultural land for non-agricultural purposes, but agriculture in itself has not become a very, very profitable. In fact, there is a crisis. So what kind of then structural transformation has India experienced? You can see, and this is consistent with what I have already said, the declining share of agriculture to GDP, the declining share of the labor force as well, but still very, very high in agriculture. Now here, of course, there is a divergence of agricultural output per agricultural worker and non-agricultural output per worker. So this is where, of course, you begin to see the differentiation taking place, whereby agriculture still remains a drag on the economy, whereas non-agriculture, in some limited sense, takes off. But again, as I have earlier indicated, that essentially the kinds of employment that is generated are of the sort of petty commodity type of systems. In other words, small scale, not very high incomes, and so on. So the features then, of course, of this compression can be seen in terms of what kind of a state does India have. Clearly, of course, it's a very non-cohesive, to use Peter Evans's term, the kind of fragmented kind of a state, if you will. It's partly development, but partly it is not. So somewhere in between. And there are, of course, pockets of efficiency, and you'll find that in Brazil, you'll find that in India, you'll find that probably in Nigeria as well. But they're only pockets. It doesn't sort of cover the entire economic system. There is bureaucratic sort of fragmentation, and of course you have, and of course there are some very specific sources of state fragmentation, especially in India. In fact, the state is actually overextended in India without the necessary sort of capacity to handle the matters, and this is partly a result of the sort of the kind of democratic sort of institutions that India inherited and internalized. So in some ways, this is a very positive thing, but it does have its sort of challenges. In other words, to manage a very large heterogeneous society with one leg in the past and then one leg trying to be in the future, I think this is a very, very difficult task for a state. And of course, India is a federated system, which means that, again, there are certain issues that are only handled by the local state authorities. So this makes the task of the role of the state also very, very difficult, even though today's state, today's government, and particularly the political leadership is trying to play a little bit of a strongman type of approach to managing some of these things. But overall, I think the state is very, very fragmented, partly because of the kind of institutions, but also because of the democratic expectations of the people. The citizens are highly politicized, but the institutions are not very strong, right? So this is a very peculiar kind of state that we are referring to. Now, when you talk about then this trajectory, of course, you can see that there is a certain amount of dynamism, but not in agriculture. And this is, I think, where the real challenge is. Weak intersectoral linkages between agriculture and industry. So the residual services has taken off. Land is economically unattractive, but people hold on to land as non-agricultural alternatives are dismal. So in other words, going to the urban areas to find alternative sources of employment, they find some. So construction could be one of those things, especially when economic growth is high. That's the time when a lot of construction activities take place and a lot of seasonal workers then move from the countryside. But once construction stops, when growth slows down, these people have no other option but to go back to their villages. So this is where I think we are beginning to see that the non-agricultural activities are also very limiting in terms of transforming or having a multiplier effect on the agricultural sector. So there is a very interesting author who's no longer with us, Kalyan Sanyal, who actually has a very interesting way of looking at this idea of this people who are outside of the orbit of capital. In other words, there is what we call a floating population. If you want, you can call them in the Marxist terms, the reserve army of labor. They're all there, they're floating, they're all over the place. They have no address, they don't have any regular jobs, they sort of go from one day to the other. And there are millions of such people around in India, in different places. So this is an interesting kind of a phenomenon of late capitalism. And the other interesting thing, of course, with late capitalism or late development in India is that the Indian state, however, cannot be indifferent to these developments because it becomes a governmentality issue. In other words, how do you govern people? How do you govern people who have nothing? This, I think, is an interesting question. So because India is relatively well steeped into democratic practices and people's expectations of rights, then it means that the state also has to treat the people in a certain way, which means there is what we call, what Partho Chatterjee, another very well-known political theorist from India, he talks about political society. And what he's basically saying is that because of the presence of such people who have no ties to capital as such, they must be somehow managed so that they don't become a source of problems, societal and political problems. So, and of course, there is also this notion of enlightenment, so which means that the state actually has to work in favor of those people and somehow give them something to get by. Now, what it does, of course, in the process, of course, then in many ways, it postpones the effects of this primitive accumulation or dispossession. In other words, this process of primitive accumulation, which is a critical part of capitalist trajectory, does not take place or is delayed indefinitely because of this notion that, well, the people have to be somewhat at least given something to look after themselves. This, I think, is something that is probably present in many other countries, but I think it's a way of putting a political lid on the so-called lumpen elements of society. So this, I think, is what makes the task of the state even more in talking about having a nice, neat, and clean kind of approach to bringing about capitalist development. I don't need to go into the other sort of details other than to point out that the kind of industrialization that India is undergoing, as in many other countries, is increasingly more of the capital intensive kind, right? So there is limited employment. In fact, there is a phenomenon, even in countries like India, where there is abundant workers, jobless growth. So there is growth, but not many jobs being created, and mainly because of automation and mechanization. In fact, there is a phenomenon in India called premature deindustrialization, which of course Daniel Roderick has referred to, although I think the process is a little bit different in the case of India. That this premature deindustrialization has many sort of causes in the case of India. And I've already pointed out the stagnation of industry relative to the other sectors, particularly the services sector. It has to do with the fact that India is part of the global economy. Indian businesses must adopt very similar types of technologies in order to be part of the global economy, which also means then there is no sort of effort to adopt what we might call appropriate technologies. So to a capitalist, of course, it doesn't matter, because the goal of the capitalist is not to generate employment, but to essentially increase its economic surplus. And for that purpose, then, if it is relevant for the capitalists to employ lots of people, they will. In fact, they do. There are lots of labor-intensive activities in India at very sort of abysmal levels of wages and work conditions. and capitalists sort of get away flouting all kinds of rules and regulations around that. But at the same time, there are also capitalists who are, very modern and very sort of commercially driven and globally driven, and they adopt the most recent sort of technologies in their sort of operations. So these two things obviously have very different outcomes in terms of what kind of jobs and what is the level of jobs and the level of wages that take place in India. India is also faced with competition, interestingly enough, even within the South Asian region. So Bangladesh is a very interesting example. Bangladesh used to be considered to be a basket case when it comes to the economy, and yet Bangladesh seems to exhibit some signs of dynamism, although still in the garments and textile sector, but it's very much sort of positioned itself globally in that particular sector. In some ways, of course, it's following the traditional sort of labor-intensive industrialization. And assuming, of course, if it goes right, then we may see some other form of diversification taking place. But what does it mean for India? I mean, India has had a very large textile and garments industry, and also internationally oriented, although the bulk of the demand is domestic, no doubt. But nevertheless, it has to compete with countries like Bangladesh. So in many ways, also there is limited participation in the global economy precisely because of the presence or competitiveness of others. Similarly, with China and East Asia, their presence limits the entry for others, such as India. So a lot of the work that gets done in India, I mean, it's not that India is cut off from the world economy, but a lot of it is contract work, precarious informal work, and of course, the persistence of the petty commodity sectors. So here's an example of Bangladesh, women increasingly entering the workforce, exporting garments under brand names, not Bangladesh's brand names, but obviously overseas multinational brand names, and exporting huge volumes of textiles and finished garments. If you look at leather, of course, is a very important export item, even from India. In fact, India boasts the largest cattle in the world. Indians, by and large, do not eat beef, but obviously the leather is used. But what we find, of course, is that a lot of the sort of low-level parts of the value chain are basically done in the developing world. And, so pretty much India is doing a lot of that, although there are certain Indian brands also that have become global. A very small one brand I can think of, High Design. I don't know if you've seen it in any airports or anything, but they make upscale products under their own brand, and it is actually an Indian company. But much of the value added is actually in the richer countries, the developed world, the markets, where the markets are, or where there are some further sort of processing, the last stages of processing that takes place, which is essentially the branding aspects of it and various other products. So the dirty part, the polluting part, the low-end part is in the developing countries, and the more sort of value-adding part is in the developed world. This is a typical sort of segmentation of global value chains, and this is, of course, for a product that countries like India, perhaps even Brazil, I'm sure Brazil has a lot of leather exports as well, they would be involved with. The question, of course, is that how do you then get into this end, that is the higher value end? In other words, what kind of brands do you create? So this, of course, is a global value chain type of an issue. And the question, of course, is where does the global South fit in all of this? And the fact that there are already present, that is the richer countries or the richer well-known brands and so on, it makes it difficult for latecomers to also enter. China, of course, is the manufacturing superpower. We all know that. Clearly, of course, its presence. And in fact, it's very astonishing that so many products that India consumes actually is made in China. And these are very simple, labor-intensive types of products. One cannot understand why Indians cannot produce it. And of course, there are, I'm sure, good reasons for it. It's not the wage cost, but I think it has to do with the fact, the ability of Chinese enterprises to produce on very, very large scale. This, I think, is the advantage that they have. The economies of scale is what the Chinese have. But here is the other sort of twist to the whole story, is that yes, labor-intensive India low value manufacturing and so on. And yet, of course, Indian companies are engaged in producing robots that essentially does this, presumably this manual work, that is basically moving boxes and moving in basically warehousing, automated warehousing. Now, warehousing activities are essentially can be done by people, but obviously they are not going that way because I suppose that it has to do with volumes, efficiency, and so on. So Indian capitalists are also using very, very recent vintages of technologies. So the persistence of the informal sector then, I mean, the data is very clear. You can see that the informal sector remains close to, is the same numbers. The numbers don't seem to change. A very, very high figure of this so-called the persistence of the informal sector, right? Now, which means that whatever growth that takes place is taking place in this sector, but obviously the growth rates are not high, and agriculture is a big part of it, right? The problem, of course, is that with capitalist development or high growth, which India has been experiencing, in fact, this year, despite the pandemic, it has now, the growth rates are beginning to recover, and they estimate it's about 7 or 8%, although probably because of the lower starting point, because of the pandemic. Nevertheless, I think the growth rates in India will continue. That I don't think that should be a surprise. But the problem is, what is the nature of this growth? And I think that's the real question. And where does this growth come from? And what we find is that given the trajectory of India, capitalist trajectory in India, we find that much of the growth is largely in this informal sector. But clearly, of course, the jobs that are generated within the sector are of the insecure, precarious types of employment. Now, in that sort of context, then, we find that the wealthy in India have continued to expand. So to give you a very sort of rough sort of figures, you can see that there were in 2012, 59 billionaires, all right, US dollar billionaires we're talking about here. And by 2018, there were 141. I've recently written a paper which should be coming out sometime next year. And I pulled it out from the analysis that I had done, is that the collective wealth of Indian millionaires between 2000 and 2019 increased from 110 billion to 2.86 trillion, which averages to 3.76 billion per millionaire. Now, these numbers, some people may say, well, why is it surprising? It's a large country, so you're likely to have, a few billionaires, a few wealthy people. But I don't think that's the issue. The issue is that the rich or the wealthy are getting wealthier in this context, just as the sort of the persistence of the petty commodity sector continues. So I think this is the thing that we want to look at. Not so much the rise of the billionaires themselves, although that in itself is also interesting because they're increasing their net worth over time even more, right? So based on Piketty's and his team, we find that the high income groups, so let's say the top 0.001% or 0.1% and so on, they seem to be growing much faster than, let's say, whether the bottom 50% or the middle 40%. This is for China. You can see China displays very similar kinds of developments, although China has a better record because its full population experiences much higher change than compared to, let's say, India. But of course, France and US are of different categories. Clearly, even though US inequality is high, nevertheless is nothing like what China and India are experiencing. Now, this in itself, I think, is also a feature of late capitalism or compressed capitalism, whereby the wealthy appear very quickly and very, very visibly. This, I think, certainly is noticeable in the case of India. So this is the divergence then you see in terms of the share of income. And this is based on tax income rather than the survey data, and based again on the Piketty and company. which of course is found in the World Inequality Report. You can find it online. You can see that clearly there is a big sort of divergence. And this divergence, of course, is indicative of the fact that the kind of trajectory that we are seeing, the capitalist trajectory that we are seeing, is not the kind of trajectory that we would have witnessed. Now, think of Kuznets. Now, Simon Kuznets talked about the worsening of inequality as growth sort of proceeded. Now, if you were to follow that logic and take it to its or extend that logic, then it may appear that perhaps, that maybe this inequality will get better, right? But I don't think so, because the structural nature of the kind of development that countries like India is witnessing is not something that will produce increasing inequality, unless, of course, there is a massive institutional overhaul. And this, of course, is a political question, and I don't think the country is ready for that kind of political sort of makeover. So in conclusion then, I mean, it's quite clear that the agrarian question must be resolved, or if it is unresolved, the type of trajectory that we see should not then come as a surprise for us. Late capitalism means that there will be room for leapfrogging, for compression, but then but what will happen is that it will always remain somewhat incomplete, and the transformation will remain incomplete. In fact, India is already, and even the government uses the term premature deindustrialization, which means that the contribution of industry is no longer increasing relative to GDP, and the incomes still remain low. In other words, although the incomes is growing, but then of course, if you break down the income statistics, in terms of poverty and so on, I mean, the picture is actually quite dismal, and it has gotten worse because of the pandemic as well. Okay. The global participation also is very difficult for India, mainly because of China's presence. Late entry widens the technology gap. Now, I remember many years ago reading about this Chilean economist, Hinke Lamart, and he made a very interesting observation, and it was only in a sentence or two, I remember, in a volume on dependency theory, I remember. And he said that in the early stages, the technology gap is smaller, and therefore the ability for so-called latecomers is probably easier to narrow that gap, which makes sense, intuitive sense. But today, of course, it means that the gaps have become very wide, and as a result of which also makes it very difficult to catch up. So obviously this requires further investigation, in the sense that to what extent the widening gap actually has become worse, and therefore becomes more difficult for many countries in the global south to sort of narrow that gap. Economic dualism is a feature of late capitalism, in the sense that there is modern dynamic sector with enclave economies, but then there is a vast sort of petty commodity sector as well. So it's a very different kind of capitalism that we are witnessing. Its lateness is both the past, in other words, there's that hangover, but also the future is now, in the sense that there are pockets of efficiency and there is an attempt to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. It was a great presentation. I took a lot of notes here. And well, I don't know if Antonio, would you like to start, or shall I?
No, I think you should start first.
Okay.
You're more the structuralist of the two of us.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, actually,
given Anthony's initial remarks, I think it's safer for you to start.
Yeah, I think I was actually thinking about Lenin when during Anthony's presentation, because it's interesting to see this concept of unevenness, which is essentially present in so many historical experiences. I would say that most of the so-called emerging countries, or the latecomers in the global south, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and China, obviously, but China is an entirely different social and economic system. But these countries, they are more the exception than the rule in terms of countries which managed not to be stuck in the middle income trap or moving out of it. And then I was, well, first, I didn't know you had this contact with Furtado, but when I read the chapter on compressed capitalism, I immediately remembered Furtado and also the Latin American structuralists, because the idea of dual economy and structural heterogeneity is very present.
Yes.
But I think one thing which is more interesting in your approach, and in this sense, it made me remember the classicals like the development of capitalism in Russia by Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and these Trotsky, is precisely this idea of a combined uneven development, which is not exactly very clear in the contributions from structural these structural school from Latin America. But I was just thinking about at the same time, what seems curious is that you had this. I don't know if you agree with that, with this statement that we have no historical instances of unevenness in the capitalist development being overcome through spontaneous capitalist development, or with so in this sense, at the same time, India had a very positive developmental experience after its independence, although it wasn't enough. The same way it wasn't enough in Mexico, it wasn't enough in Brazil, and it wasn't enough in Argentina, because all of these three countries, they different degrees, but essentially, especially Mexico and Brazil as well, large of small, the PCP sector, the informal sector. So my question would be, in this, when you have this background, do you think that because there is a recent discussion on the role of domestic markets for these large emerging countries and frugal innovation, do you see that these conditions could really contribute to eventually overcome and compress the capitalism, or it's just it's more of a false hope, like the ISI period, which also promised a lot of things which didn't take place? This is one question. And another question is, it has to do with something which is, I don't know if you agree with that. When you consider Piketty's contribution on the decoupling between rent and economic growth, and when you think about this ISI period in India and other places around the world, this decoupling was not something so present in the economy. Actually, it didn't exist. It was more of a foretaste. And then with this decoupling, it seems that compressed capitalism is no big deal for business at the moment. So differently from other situations where business had a strong incentive to industrialize or to transform the economy, because effectively driven or not driven by the state, but they were getting. So my second question is, what about business in this compressed capitalism? Is there any possibility of having a greater interest in getting out of this kind of trajectory or not? Well, and just a very brief comment. It's on the economic, the agrarian issue, which is very much the same. There has been a discussion about Latin America, the problems of Latin American industrialization due to agrarian concentration and the lack of an agrarian reform and all this stuff. And recently, it seems that many Brazilian scholars, they concentrated too much on the issues of rural development, local development, and they have forgotten, sort of forgotten the agrarian issue. And for me, it's very interesting to update this debate, because it's not water under the bridge.
Right.
I think not only because there is a lot of productivity issues and the cost of food and reproduction, but also because these agrarian elites, they are extremely powerful, politically speaking.
Yes.
And they are very intertwined with neoliberal financial capital.
Right.
Yeah. So this is okay. These are my comments, and now I hand it to Antonio.
Okay, let me take the first sort of question about, let's say, whether this frugal innovation is very similar to the kind of false hopes that, let's say, the ISI might have raised in the past. Now, the thing with ISI, and this is something I am quite sort of conscious of, is that even though the ISI program in India didn't quite produce the type of expectations that were there, nevertheless, I think sowed the seeds of many of the strengths that we see today in various sectors. So I'll give you just one example, which of course I have studied in great depth, is the Indian IT sector. Now, you don't think of the ISI program to be connected to the IT sector because, number one, they are so far apart in terms of time. The ISI was largely in the 1960s, to some extent continued in the 1970s, but then it started showing signs of exhaustion. The IT sector emerged sometime in the late 1980s, and then maybe perhaps early 1990s. But what the state did, and unwittingly, in other words, obviously they didn't know that the IT industry was to target the future, although there was some movement in the electronics industry. What the government, of course, did was to establish a higher education system. A very good quality, elitist almost, but public higher education system in the technology and science sort of areas. These institutions became the sort of hub of creating, quote unquote, technical professionals or scientific personnel, which then, of course, in the absence of, corresponding jobs during the time, what they did, of course, was to do all kinds of other things. And then once the IT sort of industry emerged, there was already, as part of ISI program, the Indian government also tried to promote the hardware sector, but again, with very limited success. Hardware sector, a lot of these people then became the source of the professional talent that we see. And then, of course, over time, this has been reinforced as the demand for such people grew at the global level. And so then these institutions became the suppliers. And then there was a demonstration effect. There were many private technical colleges that emerged. And so as a whole, this pathway, and in fact, this is why I say that, you can't ignore the past in some ways, because the past actually has a bearing on the future. And this is one way by which we can make this connection, where a completely new sector emerged in India, partly accidental and very much so externally driven. But India, I think, found a window, I would say, of opportunity, mainly because the stream of creating technical professionals has been created by the state during the ISI period. So this, I think, is one interesting sort of a phenomenon that I want to talk about. Now, when it comes to frugal innovation and such things, I agree with you in the sense that I am not particularly hopeful, because if you look at global capitalism, I mean, yes, global capitalism accommodates small players, no doubt, and even your petty commodity producers, many of them would be part of the value chain somewhere along the line, producing some small thing here and there, but they are not transformative. I mean, I think this is the thing. So if you go back to the structural transformation problem, I don't think that these types of activities, they make you feel good, but they are not transformative. I guess that's what I want to say. So this small scale approach, frugal engineering, these things would work in a local context, no doubt. But when it comes to the global context, in the sense global capitalism, they just do not stand much chance in terms of presenting their products in the world market. So domestically, yes, in fact, there are lots of products and services that are locally produced and locally consumed. In fact, the petty commodity producers produce a lot of things that are consumed by the petty commodity producers themselves. They don't enter some other kind of market, all right? So from that point of view, I don't think that, so in some ways, actually, frugal innovation and all of those things will continue to then reinforce this nature of compressed capitalism, because you will have the coexistence of both advanced technologies, but also these alternative forms of making things or alternative types of products. So in some ways, I think they sort of coexist, and this is the nature of capitalism, because it does not look like that one is completely displacing the other. And so this is where I think the nature of capitalism, because in the West, even though, as I said, I have probably reduced it, but given the fact that in the West let's say we are talking about 200-year sort of trajectory for the earlier sort of industrializing countries outside of Japan, let's say. Japan is more like 100 years, let's say. But a lot of the past, Japan is a slightly different case, but a lot of the things in the West, particularly in Europe and North America, what you find is that the past has been erased almost completely. There's no real sort of hangover, so to speak, like in petty commodity producers and that sort of thing. They disappeared. In fact, I had come across a statistic that in the earlier part of the 20th century, I think the so-called small producers or petty commodity producers in the US had already fallen to less than 10%. So in other words, they were basically on their way out. But in the global South, it's there everywhere. It's present. It doesn't seem to go away, even if Brazilian capitalists, Indian capitalists are making their global presence felt, and they're exporting, and they are good at certain things, very competitive, and so on. So that's one thing I want to say. The other is that this ISI also must be seen as a form of state-mandated rent-seeking activity. Rent-seeking activity, it's state-mandated because the state also is encouraging through this kind of industrialization, what we would call, and what I was calling in the other context, primitive accumulation. In other words, to generate capital by giving special privileges to these businesses through licensing and whatever else, and certain type of protection, obviously, whereby they could generate wealth to jumpstart a capitalist economy, right? So it is a rent-seeking kind of activity when it comes to ISI, because it is state-mandated. So it's not like, yes, there were some illegal things going on as well, underhanded things going on as well. But basically, the state is saying, no, okay, we give you license, you make this thing, you have room to make money. The idea being is to incubate And of course, this is what the state does, is to incubate capitalists in the process of catch-up, right? So this is what the state is sort of trying to do. So this, I think, is the way to think about ISI. In other words, in some ways, ISI, I mean, aside from the fact that it was a political response to the structural sort of domination of these economies, and somehow to change that structure by industrializing yourself and to substitute for imports. But it was also to create capitalists in the process. The idea was to create sort of capitalists by giving them certain room or space to create wealth for themselves. But of course, it backfired in many ways. It didn't quite go as far as it should. But also the fact remains that ISI took place in context whereby, there was a lot of people looking for work, and ISI was very capital intensive and the usual problems that arose with ISI. So I don't know if that sort of addresses some of the issues that you raised, although maybe not in a very sort of direct sort of way. When it comes to the Piketty, you say the decoupling of rent and economic growth. Now, I mean, yes, Piketty, I mean, basically what he's saying is that if you have wealth, the return on wealth is greater than your economic growth, right? So in some ways, then, the people who are already wealthy is likely to experience even more wealth. I mean, that's basically the dynamic. Even if the growth rate is high, but the return to wealth is greater than returns to the economy. Let's put it that. I mean, that's basically his simple sort of way of looking at the dynamic, all right? So in this case, of course, and therefore, I think in some ways, having the wealthy, whether in Brazil, Mexico, or India, the rise of the wealthy, it should not come as a surprise. But what should, of course, also come as not so much as a surprise, but what we should account for is also the fact that the state has deregulated the environment, economic environment. So when it has deregulated, it gives capital even more space to basically conduct their affairs and to enrich their wealth in diverse sort of ways. So in other words, they will undertake the investments, they will enlarge their markets by focusing on foreign markets. And in some cases, including in India, certain businesses actually, even today, have given certain types of protection, political protection. So in other words, the state is actually choosing capitalists in India in some ways and promoting them. So for example, this Ambani family, which is, I don't know if you're aware of it. I mean, they're there's two brothers, but one brother is more successful, and they inherited a business from their father, who was an interesting character himself, in the sense, very austere man and all of that, but very sort of smart in the sense that he was very much involved in backward integration over time. And he created the world's largest petrochemical complex in India, right? But he started off as a trader in synthetic yarn, right? So this is this very sort of gradual backward integration. Then the sons inherited the business. Of course, they are now diversified into telecommunications and so on. But the government is actually, favoring this particular family business. What the agenda is, I don't know, but maybe it is a political sort of project than anything else. As far as the government is concerned, but they are very, very wealthy, and their wealth has expanded, without question, and they are diversifying, and they have the room to do that. In other words, the space is there, the government is making space. So this increase in wealth must also be seen in that quote unquote neoliberal context. In other words, the regulations have disappeared, and these regulations are not just domestically, but globally speaking. Capital is deployed now globally, and even these guys, although they are still very domestically oriented, but they have pretty much captured the Indian market, and the Indian market is not that small. So businesses then will become wealthy, those who are already wealthy, and that's basically what I think Piketty is basically saying. So if you have growth, then obviously the wealth will increase even more. So this decoupling, so to speak, is actually, it's only decoupling in the sense that the wealthy will continue as long as they have the room to deploy their wealth even more. And if there is economic growth, which we expect in many countries, including India, their wealth will also increase even further. So in other words, it will reinforce it, in fact. So that is, I think, what we can expect. So now coming to that last question that you had, so do businesses care in this type of a, compressed capitalist situation? No, I don't think the businesses care. To them, their goal is essentially to, as long as they are able to reproduce themselves on an expanding scale, they really don't care as to what other things. They don't have any social project per se. Yeah, they may have some philanthropic foundation arm here and there, but those are, those are more publicity stunts than anything else. So they, of course, will continue. Now, the only thing is that if there is a threat to their accumulation process, politically speaking, let's say, and I don't see it in the immediate future in India, certainly not in India. But you can have noises coming from here and there, especially when it comes to issues of inequality. Although it still quite hasn't captured the imagination in India, because India, in many ways, socially speaking, is almost, by definition, unequal. It's ingrained in that social system, that people know what their position is in society, that kind of thing. So therefore, but it can still backfire in the sense that if the impoverishment, which of course, I have pointed out in one of my recent papers, that the impoverishment in the context of this huge amassing of wealth, if this becomes a political sort of problem, then I think obviously there will be some movement in the way by which perhaps businesses may want to somewhat sort of dilute their presence in some big sort of way. In other words, maybe more transfers to the poor or to the marginalized populations. Already the Indian government actually has a mandatory corporate social responsibility program for the organized businesses. In other words, they have to contribute some 1% of their revenues or some such thing. Now, what it is being used for, I have no idea. How the corporations are using it, obviously, they may actually on paper spend 1%, but what they're using it for, I don't know. And what the outcome of that is also, I don't know. But these are not the ways by which you transform, structurally transform economies. I mean, the structurally transform, like I said, you need to get that agricultural sector going somehow. We are talking about 50% of the people workforce in agriculture. I mean, that's what is really the important dimension. If that is not addressed, we are still going to have this kind of capitalist trajectory, which is a kind of a blend of this, small scale, a few large scale, enclave, dual persistence of the petty commodity sector, and so on.
Okay, thank you. Antonio? You have to unmute, Antonio.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. Well, first of all, let Anthony breathe a little bit. And first, I want to thank you for the magisterial tour de force that you provided us, knowing a lot of food for thought and a lot of challenges, a lot of intriguing questions and topics, for us to discuss. And also, I think the purpose of this series is to help us Brazilians to first, to think more comparative, but also help as we think Brazil as you see others. And I think you did a great job in terms of raising questions and issues which are extremely relevant for us, and we haven't thought about them. At least made us rethink them in the face of the Indian context and Indian evolution. And I think it was very nice also that the way you set up your talk, in terms of recovering some of your previous series, and you're very skillful in terms of saying that you're not going to talk about agents, but that's everything you did is talking about agents all the time. In the sense that you said you got to do a structural presentation, but there's a lot of agency there. So,
right.
So that was very good. So let me make a couple of comments, and I'll have one big question in a way, which I hope you address, your main theme, which is land. But a sort of small comments and questions. I don't want to address the small questions. I just wanted to address my final question. But one has to do with the whole issue of compression, that you talk about compression as a concept, and then you go back and say that was not such a new concept, and you talk about how you thought it was a neat sequence. In fact, it was never a neat sequence, as we all know. I mean, Gershon Crown shows that it was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears for all the early developers and early industrializers. No, so we have to, in a way, to demystify that, and also we can have a more even comparison with the past too. I think the contextual comparison is very good, but you also have to demystify the past as something that was neat, it was never neat. And I think Gershon Crown and a series of historical scholars over the last 50 years have shown us that. And you have to kind of stop, mystifying that. And I think you're right in talking about the timing, but when you talk about timing, I mean, as you said, the context is changing all the time, and what's the right timing now? Because I mean, a lot of in Latin America, we discuss, our time is not very good, Furtado talked about the terms of trade, but at the same time, you saw all the Asian countries taking off, at the worst time. So what's a good time for one can be the bad time for the other. So we have to be careful about when you bring some of the timing argument into the picture now. In relation to one other point is relation to the fragmented state being captured. If I understood well your argument, the capture, then you gave us more information about, in the sense that the land reform is no longer on the political agenda. And so the capture state by the rural elites, so I understood, the capture for you has to do with the rural elites, because there's no land reform, which is, of course, is a cherished topic in about the whole South and Southeast Asian development. Me and Moises were just advising a thesis on South Korea, and I've been reading a lot about South Korean land reform, where a lot of the debate hinders on exactly what you just said. But there the argument is a little different, is that, okay, is the political argument, and that's also done, or others have done, about Thailand and the Philippines, where the rural is more closer to our argument. But also there's an older argument, which I think is the one you're trying to address. At the same time, it has like the older argument by Gershon Crown, the commercialization of agriculture, if I understood it well. There is the political argument, the land elites they don't exist anymore, so they don't capture the state. I think, whereas in India, they continue to exist, so they capture the Indian state. Although it's still not clear to me what it did to the state. I mean, which period are we talking about there? I mean, when did the capture occur, and it has been lasting up to today? How did it affect the ISI? What did it affect there now? So I think we need more precision in that, in trying to understand how does it affect the current state and the future state of India now. And I think the issue that you're trying to address, and I think you made it clear towards the end, is more the commercialization of agriculture. It's the old theme of Gershon Crown. I mean, countries are not developed, they don't commercialize agriculture, and if you don't generate incomes, so we can finance industrialization. And that is also something that's a very large theme in Brazil, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Another point, is just my gripe with some local structuralists in Brazil. When you talk about the latest modernization mantra, getting the state capacities right, kind of people throw now. The big problem nowadays, states don't have capacities, which I think is a lot of bullshit, pardon my French, because that begs the question whether states can learn, because, okay, if what you've been doing for 30, 50 years is right, it's just a question of implementation capacity, then there's a serious problem about what you're talking about learning here. And then also begs your question that you said, the context has been changing, the state has to change, and then how the state, the response you had for 50 years, and it was just an issue of implementation, it's not going to solve the problem nowadays. Sorry. So I think there's a dissonance there, and I think that we are just bringing up the theme that you kind of just threw that, but it's not really the thrust of your talk, and I know that. And then I was thinking, when you talk about the dispossession, or if in fact, when you talk about the dispossession of the people in the land, if that's not the true compression, it's more like an endogenous compression, because you see that's the real constraint. We're talking about compressed, but in fact you're talking about constraints, structural constraints, in a way to put it. In fact, but the way you construct, and you beautifully showed us, that the issue of land, is what's really holding back India, if I understood well. So that's the real endogenous constraint for India, develop in a more consistent and a more neat way, you know, at least trying to imagine this neat way of the past, of beautifying the past, you know. In that, perhaps that will be the real component of capitalism, you know. And also in relation when you talk about how the distributional effects of the previous policy of redistribution in India, you know, and that applies to Brazil, and I think it's very interesting. That's one area we probably need to collaborate and think more together. To what extent, you know, the leapfrog is not going to be a technological one, but your leapfrog is going to leapfrog the welfare state into a transfer state, which I think that's what's happening in India, what's happening in Brazil, and in several other emerging countries now, particularly in Latin America now. That's, I mean, I think the welfare state is gone for us. We're going to be transfer states. We're going to leapfrog that. So we have to think, you know, in that sense. And also I'd like to hear a little bit more. We didn't really talk much about it, but I know you've done work on that, about the role of professional immigrants, you know, because to what extent that's more like a side question, to what extent you think this professional immigrants and that you look at, you know, how they bring, you know, not only remittances, but also technology, and they bring in business, whether could they transfer, you know, Indian economy, you know, or the land is still the real constraints, you know. They're gonna also, they only change the margins, and the margins not gonna be big enough to change the country, which seemed like the argument, but I wanted to see how you go there. And then finally, my big question about the issue of the land, you know, I think it goes back to the issue of commercialization of agriculture, because, okay, in Brazil, okay, you still have the destitute, you have the dispossession, but Brazil, in a way, commercialized agriculture, you know, to a large extent. And that, okay, in more contemporary times, the last 20 years, Brazil become an agricultural power, blah, 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 blah. And that seems to be an exit for the Brazilian failure industrialization and the deindustrialization. Of course, you know, the agricultural reform at a national scale never happened in Brazil, but the agricultural accumulation, you know, there's been very good historical studies in Brazil, regional historical studies that show commercialization of agriculture occurring in very specific, you know, regions and states, like especially in the state of São Paulo, which had this dual aspect of being a very agriculture, and they become a very industrialized. And there was this, although there was no actual land reform there, there was a transfer of wealth from the agriculture, from the industrialization. That's a very good historical studies like Maurice Font and others have shown that, I mean, this capital was critical for the São Paulo industrialization, in a way leveraged the Brazilian industrialization, sketching in a very sketchy way. So I'm just wondering if in the case of India, no, I don't know much about India agriculture, much less India economy, as you can tell, except for the IT sector, which I know a little bit. To a large extent, where there are in India, there are like regions or areas in India where you have this commercialization of agriculture has happened. Because I kind of hear, I read very sparse thing, you know, and could the change, you know, come from these peripheral regions or some of the regions that could, like, in a way, irradiate to the rest of India or not? And is there a possibility there for this transformation coming from the land, from a very specific or a small set of these decentralized areas that then could lead, you know, to a transformation, structural transformation of the Indian economy, you know? And a related question has to do with, which I wrote here, you know, can we talk, because you mentioned that a lot of the agricultural people nowadays know they still in the agriculture, but they like involved in transportation and other activities now. Can you also think another possibility for India? You'll be some sort of decentralized rural urbanization. I mean, it could be like a small industry emerging, you know, in different areas, and then we're gonna have a transformation of the agriculture. I don't know, just raising possibilities, you know, and I like taking the opportunity, since you're an expert, and to hear from you there. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. I hope you will have time for some questions from the public.
My question to Anthony: could we pick up 2 questions from the floor?
And then Anthony, you just answer whatever you feel like. Don't feel obliged to answer everything, and because of the time.
Sure.
Time. So just it's more to be a generate debate. But let's pick a couple questions for the audience, and then you answer the last block. Okay. That's right. Do you have any questions from the audience?
I don't know. Bruno has left. Irina, one.
Yeah, I have question. You know, I was thinking while we were talking. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Just let's see if there is someone else. Bruno, would you like to have a question? Okay, so Irina, Yarina, and Bruno. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, while we were thinking about, this like delay and the big this agricultural sector is still in India and persistence, So I was thinking, and we were discussing like economical means and structural changes, but it just what I observed, back in Ukraine, also thinking about this like agricultural and traditional, let's call it sector, there is like resistance to capitalism in cultural meaning, because people just value this traditional style life, and perceive capitalism like something that like takes meaning from things. That this is you can live like rich, maybe in a city, in a nice apartment, but you will lose something important, existentially. So this is cultural. So is it the factor in India, this cultural resistance to capitalism, and how you can address this?
Okay. All right. Bruno?
Yes, well, thank you very much for this very stimulating talk, and for reminding how many aspects we have in common between the big economies in the global south and their fragile models of capitalism that are leading to these levels of concentration, of lack of participation, and difficulties to create more integrated ways of upgrading and improvement. So I think there are so many topics there that can be discussed. Well, let me just make like two, three questions. One would be on the colonial heritage that we've been talking about in the introduction. If you take, for example, the Acemoglu framework, which I've been like critical about it, but I would like to know your opinion in the sense that there we have in the case of India, we would have another example of a country with British colonial heritage. So what's the role of this institutional background created from the British colonial system? Because of course it's diverging from Acemoglu's conclusions that British regimes would lead to a more adequate application of capitalist institutions and building a framework for that. It's a very, this dichotomy is not working in many senses, but still I would like to know your opinion about the British heritage of these institutional structures. My second question would be about levels of analysis. I think it's very difficult to maintain the influence of national level models. There's been this critique also on like methodological nationalism, and I think in the case of India, this is something that's maybe very, very much present because of the size, the complexity, and the big diversity in cultural terms. And so, can we really talk about India in that sense when we talk about these topics? Or what would be possible? I mean, national policies and efforts to build models are, of course, still important, but they're also very, in a sense, limited. But what would be your take on that?
Okay.
And the one last point would be just quickly. I don't know if there's time. There's of course now this discussion about the agrarian reforms in India that's been that collapsed, that they take back. Could you just briefly?
Sure. I was going to use that to address Antonio's question on the land issue. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. So let me take this one question from Antonio on the commercialization of agriculture. Let's just sort of start with that. This was your toward the end, I mean, there were many obviously other questions, but let me start with that one, the commercialization of agriculture. So, and then this will also in some ways address Bruno's last comment on this question about agriculture. The thing is that there is, of course, in India, different states and different regions of the country that have specialized in certain types of commercial crops. So, for example, just like Brazil, India has a lot of sugarcane, right? But Brazil, of course, the sugarcane is being used for something industrial purpose as well. Whereas in India, Indians have a very sweet tooth. They eat a lot of sweets. So sugar is a very, very big part of the crop. But there are certain regions where, there are cooperatives, large-scale cooperatives that have organized themselves, especially in the state of, say, Maharashtra, which is one of the wealthier states in the West. They have cash crops, what we call cash crops. There has been a diversification of Indian agriculture away from subsistent types of production for those households that have a little bit more capital, perhaps a little bit larger sort of land that they have. And so they have diversified into what we call the cash crops, such as, vegetables actually is considered to be a cash crop as opposed to grains, let's say, right? So whether it's vegetables or fruits, in fact, India is, beginning to export grapes and strawberries, which is unheard of. In Europe, I used to find, in Denmark, I used to find, grapes from India. So which I never seen those things before, but this is obviously part of that process whereby there is a certain kind of diversification among the slightly better off farmers who can now diversify into these cash crops, and there is some kind of a value chain there. Obviously, somebody is organizing it, but the commercialization of agriculture has been an attempt by this government. And there are some actually well-meaning, let me say, agricultural economists who have been saying this, that somehow India has to produce agricultural output on a larger scale. I mean, that's basically what they're talking about. So in other words, go the capitalist way in terms of scale, when it comes to scale. This is the attempt they have been trying to introduce for a long time, but farmers do not obviously find that kind of incentive strong enough to go in. Those who have the land, those who have the resources or capital, then they can, and they are beginning to make, larger scale operations. But Indian farms on the average are very small. I mean, that's the one thing, is they're very, very small. The government has been trying to do it, and this over this past 1 year, the government, and of course, this is where the unsmartness of the government shows up, because they try to simply ram it down the farmers' throats by trying to introduce so-called these reforms, agricultural reforms. And the idea was that they would do away with so-called middlemen. Now, the way Indian agriculture works is that there is a wholesale market, all the farmers take it to that wholesale market, and then there's an intermediary or middle sort of broker, if you will, who then sort of buy it off and then sell it off in other retail kind of markets. And what the government was trying to sort of convince the farmers that, well, we'll eliminate this middleman, and you can sell it directly to whoever you want. They're telling the farmers, that is, and thereby obviously increase the incomes more for the direct sellers. That was one. The other, of course, is that, and it was quite unclear, and this is where I think the farmers got really mad, was that India has a minimum support price, MSP. It's known as MSP for the output of the grain. So which means that the farmers are guaranteed a certain price. And this set of reforms indicated, although it didn't quite explicitly say so, that somehow the MSP will be removed. And this is what pissed off all the farmers. They were really mad at this, and that's why they protested over more than a year, and then finally the government relented. And of course, telling them that, well, no, the MSP will not be removed, but the farmers will not believe unless they see something in writing. So this idea of commercialization of agriculture has been going on for quite some time, but it is already in any case taking place. So I'll give you one other example. So I talked about Reliance, the Ambani family, which is one of the wealthiest families. One of the other things that they have done is large-scale grocery stores. Now, as you know, in India, most of the basic grocery items are sold through small enterprises. They are neighborhood stores, owned by a family or individual or whatever. Very small sort of volumes of it. So this large idea of large-scale retail, of course, Brazil, I know, has large-scale retail for a long, long time. In India, that was largely absent, although now we're beginning to see the presence of that. Walmart tried to enter India, but could not, okay? So it was very difficult for Walmart. So, but Reliance, on the other hand, was able to, and as I said, the government gives it a little bit more space, So, so Reliance was able, does open this. Now, the thing is that what this means, especially let's say when it comes to farm products, it means then that the production of farm output has to be done also on a larger scale. So which means that the idea of contract farming has in India. So in other words, there will be large-scale producers who will be contracted out to produce X amount of this or that, and of course, the idea of standardization, because if the output comes from small farms, the output is very heterogeneous. It's not, the cauliflower does not look the same from every farm, right? But when you're selling it in a big grocery store, you want to have standardization. And so this kind of standardization means also that there has to be certain controls in place and certain kind of mechanisms in place that will allow for large volume of output with a very standardized kind of output. This is the kind of pressure that many sort of, basically the agricultural sector is facing. But not everybody is in a position to undertake this, but there are entrepreneurial types of farmers who are able to do it. So the process of commercialization has already begun, and the pressure to commercialization has already been present. But obviously, there are other ways by which it's happening. In fact, one would say it's happening by stealth. In other words, whatever else is going on here, the big businesses are already organizing agriculture in a certain kind of way. Now, to what extent, of course, this will have a transforming impact in terms of commercialization of agriculture is yet to be seen, because I doubt that it will commercialize Indian agriculture as a whole. It will commercialize certain parts of it, certain areas of the country, especially those areas that have better landholding sort of sizes and more entrepreneurial type of farmers. They will, obviously, if they find it profitable, they will get into it. But since we have about 50% of people tied to the agricultural sector, in fact, most of them will not be able to participate in this kind of development. So that's where I would put the nature of commercialization of agriculture. But the pressure is there, and we will see some movement in that direction, but obviously not to the extent that Indian agriculture will become commercialized. In fact, Indian agriculture will remain small holding based type of agriculture. Okay, I hope that sort of addresses somewhat the questions that you had about agriculture. Antonio is correct, and a related issue there. Antonio is correct that this dispossession is an endogenous constraint. In other words, how you need to dispossess. So in other words, primitive accumulation is a necessary condition for capitalist development. I mean, we know, at least historically, we know that. I mean, it is a necessary condition.
The debate going on.
But yes, it's been, but the thing is that, in places like India or late industrialization, this is not a process that is going on. In the sense that it is an ongoing process with, so for example, again, that notion that somehow you have to at least look after the people who are left out, in many ways is postponing primitive accumulation because you're not allowing them to be dispossessed. And of course, one must also understand that, as I said, that India is a very politicized society. So Indians have come to recognize their rights very, very strongly. In fact, there was a rightist turn, not in the political right-wing turn kind of thing, but a rightist turn in the sense that people began to demand certain rights, all kinds of rights, information rights, education rights, all kinds of political rights, and so on and so forth. These rights, there was actually a moment in Indian recent political history, is that there was a rightist turn in Indian society, whereby the state began to accommodate all these demands from the civil society in terms of rights, right? So given that consciousness, that means that the Indian government cannot be completely indifferent, even if it has the power to do so, but it cannot be completely indifferent from the kind of, elements of those elements of the society that are being completely left out. It cannot be. So it has to do something for them. So this dispossession then is, in some ways, a real dilemma in the Indian capitalist trajectory, because on the one hand you need it, but on the other hand you can't completely have it. But it's still taking place, because as land becomes more valuable, as land becomes valuable because of its non-agricultural use, and as growth takes place, which means incomes are rising for a certain class of people, and cities are also, cities are already huge. They have to expand outward. Yes, they're building upward, no doubt, but obviously wealthy people like to have standalone house, family, single family owned standalone kind of a house. They need space. For all of those reasons, there are encroachments. And of course, whatever industrialization is taking place will also be encroaching ultimately on agricultural land. In fact, there is actually a land acquisition kind of an act, which this particular government tried to actually make it even more difficult for farmers to not to be able to sell their land. But there are limits to what can be done. So, and this is part of the whole rights-based movement, whereby acquisition in itself is limited. In fact, you have to pay 3-4 times the market price in order to get land if it's going to be used for non-agricultural purposes. So these are political pressures, which then in many ways limit dispossession, even though farmers, if they find the prices attractive enough, they will sell. Many farmers would sell, but not all of them, because again, the only asset that they have is land. They don't have any other asset. So this is a very peculiar sort of situation whereby it's neither here nor kind of there, but the dispossession process is again a very slow but ongoing process, very slow ongoing process. So in other words, primitive accumulation from that point of view is really very, very slow, and who knows, it may never completely take place. So that's pretty much what I would like to sort of say regarding the land question and the commercialization of agriculture. To quickly address Yarina's question about cultural factors, yes, it is a factor, but not in the way that somehow it impedes, let's say, the adoption of technologies or that sort of thing. In other words, in fact, at least in the Indian case, most of the surveys or the data regarding agriculture pretty much indicates that nobody really wants to farm. All right. Nobody wants to farm. If they can get out, they will get out, but they cannot get out. That's the difficulty, right? So in that sense, I don't think it's a it's an activity they value. Now, there might be individuals who may have a lot of land and they enjoy, a certain kind of, rural but comfortable existence. That's slightly different. But for most people, it is not an option. In fact, the younger generation is, that's where some of that migration comes in. That is where also the non-farm type of employment in the countryside also comes about, because it's the young people who are educated, a little bit more better educated, who then take up non-farming occupations. Mm-hmm. So this is another kind of social change that we are witnessing. So nobody knows. So in that sense, no, they do not want to be actually in farming. To come to Bruno's question about the colonial heritage, yes, Acemoglu and Robinson, they have a very, again, a very neat and clean understanding of institutions. In other words, there's only one set of institutions that basically work, and and that's what everybody should try to sort of emulate. Okay, so obviously that's a problem, because again, institutions are creatures of society and history. They just don't, yes, you can shape them, you can engineer some of them, but over the overall package, the institutional package or bundle that comes with it is not something that you can easily sort of shape. Now, the interesting thing with the British colonial heritage, of course, is that yes, Britain did institute certain types of, politically speaking, a very kind of a liberal sentiment, let's put it this way. More of the Enlightenment kind of thing, although when they were jailing people, the Enlightenment part was quite the picture. But the point is that, yes, they did sort of endow India with it, but also more importantly, and to go back a little bit further, the British created a tax collecting mechanism in the countryside. In other words, increasing revenues. One must understand that the British government in India was self-financing, which means all the money that was needed to run India by Britain was raised in India. All right. So in other words, money did not come from London to rule India. The money to rule India came from India itself. So one of the things that the British cleverly did was they relied on an existing system, tax collection system, which was basically under the Mughals, the previous sort of ruling nobility that pretty much ruled most of the country, not all of it, but most of it. They already had a very elaborate tax collecting mechanism. What the British did was that they simply relied on it, except that this time what they did was they collected the taxes in advance from the tax collectors. Mm. So, which meant then, of course, the tax collectors would be pretty ruthless in getting the taxes from the peasants or the farmers, and of course, paying tax meant that they had to earn income in cash, which means then the process of commercialization of agriculture in a small way begins at that level. That is the introduction of taxes in the countryside, and the British were trying to maximize their revenues so that they could then run the government in India. So the British actually introduced a tax system using the existing system, and then basically to contribute to the sort of commercialization of agriculture, because then they had to sell it in the market to earn basically cash. So this was one sort of aspect on the agricultural front. Of course, there are many other kinds of endowments that the British, of course, gave to India. The language English being one of the principal sort of endowments, but also the bureaucratic system, of course, excessively bureaucratic system, which is, it's often a problem in its own right. But I think that in some ways, yes, there were certain kinds of institutions, particularly in the area of so-called law and order. Law and order, and this law and order was devolved to the extent at the sort of local levels, which, of course, on independence, then the Indian government used this decentralized form of bureaucracy also for development purposes. So in other words, the development project then got diffused to these local levels through these administrative structures. So for example, in India, you have these units, administrative units called blocks. So, you know, a certain region of a state may have several blocks, and each block will have what is known as a BDO, or a block development officer. So the block development officer would be in charge of disbursing any kind of development funds that come from the state, from other levels of the state, and then to put it into, you know, use in those sort of local areas. So in that sense, one might say that yes, that you know, it was an inheritance of the British when it also comes to you know, to development at that very sort of small local kind of level. Yeah, so then I think that yes, there are certain types of institutions, but I think the problem, of course, is that there are many laws that still exist in the books today, and the Indian government refuses to get rid of them because it serves its own purpose very well. So, for example, anything to do with terrorism or anti-national activities and so on, these are actually colonial laws. and they want, and so this government is actually using those laws you know, to protect itself, you know, and abusing it. In fact, one might say even abusing it. So there are obviously certain negative aspects to it as well. But I think the most important contribution, I think, although there has been some erosion of it, is the liberal democratic ideas in the Indian context. Because one has to understand that India, by definition, in terms of its social structure, is very illiberal. And yet, this imposition of a foreign sort of system, parliamentary system, which of course the Indian elites at the time of independence really embraced it and internalized it, to the point that, of course, India works on a constitutional federated kind of a system. Even though today this particular government is often trying to, you know, find ways to, you know, not sort of, you know, adhere to some of these constitutional sort of issues. But basically that, I think, is perhaps the most important element that the British have endowed in India, and the Indians have embraced, most Indians have embraced it, and they are fully aware of their rights. So I think this is perhaps what might, and then of course, as Antonio said, you know, leapfrogging into the welfare dimension, maybe this is the only hope that we have in the case of India, where politically then it may continue to push the government in that sort of direction. I mean, there are many programs in India which no other country has. So for example, India actually has the world's largest employment program in the countryside. So in other words, anybody who wants to work, you know, do manual work for 100 days a year will be guaranteed work for 100 days in the countryside, right? Now, the implementation is done by the different local states, so therefore the results are not particularly even. Obviously, some states do a better job than others, but the government of India has this mandated federal program, which basically says, you want to work 100 days a year, we'll give it to you. And what they do is, of course, you know, basically, you know, building rural roads, digging trenches. So in other words, it's kind of a Keynesian type of an approach, in the sense that, you know, you creating some certain kind of demand, or in this case, it's not so much demand, but it's really, you know, putting food on the table kind of thing, because these are obviously quite desperate people who will do this kind of work. But for some, it could be an offsetting, I mean, additional income in addition to what they're already doing, because agriculture is very seasonal. So there are parts of the year when you're not really doing much. You know, the planting season is over, you're waiting for the harvest season. In between, what do? You know, you can go to the cities to find some work, or take up this offer from the government. So these are some of the programs that actually already exist in India. These are various types of welfare types of programs, which of course, you know, obviously need to be strengthened, better implemented, and so on, but they are already there. So obviously, in some sense, then, you know, the question is, you know, will the future, given, you know, the kind of crisis that is plaguing the agricultural sector, and of course not enough jobs in the urban areas, and whatever jobs, they are very sort of precarious types of jobs. Will these types of developments push the public to expect more from the government in terms of trying to have perhaps a more acceptable standard of living, right? So so from that point of view, then I would say that the British legacy is, I think, where the positive aspect is this idea that you are an individual and you have certain rights. That is being internalized very, very strongly in the case of India. Okay, and then I will address one last question, and that is on the role of IT professionals. This, of course, is perhaps one of the most visible and perhaps the I would say a very successful sector. And I myself have written quite a bit, but there's a fair amount of literature on this. The question, of course, is that what about the so-called diaspora? I mean, basically what we are referring to is the diaspora. That is the overseas Indians working. Now, the one correction I want to make based on what Antonio said, and it's actually quite understandable to say that about remittance income. But I have to say that these professionals are not the major sources of remittance income.
No.
The reason for that, of course, is that they are already coming from relatively well-off families, that is, educated middle-class families. So therefore, sending money back home is not that sort of compelling.
Yeah, I was referring to the remittance from the Indians in the Middle East countries.
Exactly. That's where the remittance income is from. Is mainly the working class people. They are the ones who are sending money, and of course, Middle East or the Gulf countries are the major sources of remittance income. Now, the question, of course, and the development literature also tries to address this question, is what is the role of remittance income on development, right? So, I mean, yes, I mean, at the very sort of basic level, there is a positive sort of impact, because this extra income that comes in and it encourages families in terms of their savings rate, but also and then therefore contributes to better children's education. But also, I think there is and this has been visible in the state of Kerala, where a lot of migrants from Kerala go to the Gulf countries. In fact, I don't know if you've heard this saying that Dubai is the best run Indian city.
No, I never heard of it.
There is an Indian character in the Squid Games from South Korea. Have you seen that?
No, I have not.
Yeah, it's a Netflix series.
Yeah.
And there's also a migrant. Huh?
Are you talking about Squid Game? No.
Yeah.
Squid Game, yeah.
Seen it yet. I know I have not seen it yet. But anyway, the point is that yes, there are a lot of migrants, but these migrants are of course temporary workers, which means then they only go for a year or two on contract, but they save whatever they can of their earnings, and then they repatriate it back home. So there is a positive element to this, but I think some of the well, I wouldn't say negative. I mean, it's people do whatever they want to do with their money. It's their business. But a lot of big houses are created in these places where they stand out, when the rest of the environment, but because they have this so-called, petrodollars or whatever it is, that they have these big houses, which in some ways is an unproductive investment, if you ask me, from an economic development point of view.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, they are spending more money on their children's education, perhaps getting better healthcare and so on. So overall, yes, their standard of living has increased. Kerala is one of those states, I think, where you can see the impact of this sort of remittance income. But even though India receives the highest volume of remittance income, but it's still small change when it comes to the economy as a whole. So in other words, again, we don't expect the remittance income to be a major driver of economic development, except in those places where the money is fairly concentrated. Yes. But when it comes to the technical, the professionals, it's a very different kind of an impact. There is a major developmental impact in the sense that they actually have contributed to new businesses in India. In other words, not only existing operations out of the US, let's say, have operations in India, and so a lot of exporting of services are taking place, high value services, but also many Indians have elected to go back and basically start their own operations, which means that they become entrepreneurs and they grow their own business, and then they also start exporting. So from a export revenue point of view, the IT industry has done very, very well. It's very large. I mean, the IT industry does not employ more than maybe 3.5 million people or so, but they contribute, over $100 and some billion worth of export revenues, right?
Plus the pharmaceutical sector is a significant one.
And pharmaceutical sector is now beginning to do that, but that's because of the generic markets that they have positioned themselves in, and of course with some movement in also moving into branded products. So in fact, I was taking my recent medications, which is a Bayer product, right? But then I saw it was made in India.
Okay.
So yes, no, the US is a major market for Indian pharmaceutical products for sure. So the thing is that, yes, there is a movement, this entrepreneurial movement. And in fact, I read constantly in the business press about startups in India. And again, but these startups are all in this sort of information technology type. So for example, this payment system, there's a company called Paytm, right? And it's going on for an IPO, and the numbers are just mind-boggling when they go for this initial public offering. Billions of dollars. I mean, it's like, what's the value of this thing? And yet, public wants it. There's this, demand for these types of operations, and the government is now beginning to encourage it as well. So so here's the thing. I mean, it's not so much, I mean, yes, there are some established manufacturers, no doubt, but there are this whole new sector that is emerging, which is pretty much very information technology driven type of sectors, and a lot of new startups. But lot of these startups have connections to the overseas sort of technical professionals who of course encourage it, who influence it, and so on and so forth.
Fantastic. Well, Anthony, thanks 1,000. I think you run to a marathon over 2 hours.
All right.
It was really, really great. Yeah,
it was fantastic. It was really exciting, very, very engaging. I think, given the level of back and forth we had here, and also thank Yarina and staff. It's small but very qualified in the audience.
Yes, thank you very much for
faithful for 2 hours here.
You don't find too many attendees, with so many Zooms going around all over the place.
Yes,
exactly. But at least as we have broadcast on the YouTube, over the YouTube, I think that this is gonna. And what strikes me most is how you manage to move from such abstract, or not abstract, but more general concepts like Brodel, Wallerstein, and also more very micro level things like firms, strategies, and sectors. That's really fantastic. Yeah, it's really impressive.
Aula magna.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you very much again, and let us stay in touch. I know Antonia and Moises will have a few things to discuss.
Yeah, we'll set up let's give you time to rest after this webinar and get well, and then we'll set up a time.
All right, sounds good, very good. And thank you, Bruno, for being there and asking questions. I hope we will meet again, if not online, in somewhere. I mean, I'm planning to go to Paris next month, but let us see. I'm monitoring the COVID situation.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
I participate in this. I don't know if you've heard of this group called Jerpisa, which is a French-based
organization. Yes.
Jerpisa, they do the automobile industry. workers.
I'm trying to establish a Japanese equivalent for the oil industry.
Okay. All right. So
I love you. In fact, I mean, if you know the organizer of Japanese, I'd love to, if you can put him in touch, because I want to get some of their organizational know-how, because they have a long-standing experience. They want to replicate that for the oil industry.
Who's Italian, but he has been leading JERPISA in the last few years. So I belong to the steering committee, and so this is the first time last 2 years the meetings were held online for obvious reasons, but this time they want to have it in person. So then I said, okay, then I need to also get out, I really need to get out. I'm just sort of, my whole professional life has come to a very strange kind of a place, because I used to travel all the time and organize my professional life around them, and now I just this endless kind of days and evenings. It's like, so anyway, I'll definitely put you in touch with Tommaso.
I appreciate it. And then we talk. And
sure.
Going to Paris is not going to hurt you, don't worry.
Yeah. So.
And you're not so far from Mexico either.
I am not. I am not. In fact, how long are you there in Mexico? For a while, or?
I'm working here. I'm living here.
Life.
So you're living
20 years.
How long?
Right.
Yeah, I will stay here. So I hope that we'll have an opportunity to invite you to Mexico also.
Yeah. I actually not too long ago, maybe a year or two ago, I joined I think it's one of those science type of Mexican universities, and I'm trying to think, but they have they have a journal, and I think I joined the editorial board on that. It's a Mexico-based journal. I'll dig it up and I'll let you know. Although not that I have done anything for them yet.
There'll be a time.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I want to
thank you.
All of you. Thanks, Stephen.
And you'll be in touch.
All right.
And Bruno,
Take care.
Anthony.
Have
a good rest.
Care.
Get well properly.
Thank you, Yarina.